Hey guys, tonight, we're going to drift into the fascinating quiet world of West African scribes, the ones who turned burnt bark into ink, long before the age of modern pens and printers. Picture yourself under the African sky, the air thick, with the scent of trees and earth as a skilled scribe mixes the charred remnants of bark into the perfect ink. No computers, no high-tech tools, just the earth, a little fire, and a lot of patience. It's a world far from the hurried pace of our digital lives, and you probably won't survive this in a literal sense. Don't worry, it's all good. But trust me, it's enough to make you feel the weight of the past. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Chetinas. Now let's rewind time. Long before ink was mass-produced in factories, West African scribes were crafting it by hand, and it all started with something remarkably simple: the bark of trees. It's hard to imagine now, but the creation of ink was an intricate art that required not just skill, but an understanding of nature. These scribes were as much a part of the environment as the trees they harvested their materials from, and this deep connection made the whole process feel, well, sort of sacred. Think of it like this: you're living in a time before the written word was common. Stories were passed orally, handed down through the generations. But what if you wanted to capture that knowledge and preserve it for future generations? You could carve it into stone, of course, or paint it on a wall. But that's a lot of effort, right? So scribes, in places like Mali and the Kingdom of Ghana, found a way to do it on materials that could be rolled up, folded, and stored. All they needed was something to write with, and that's where this ink-making process began. The burning of bark to create ink might sound pretty basic. After all, fire a tree and some charcoal, it doesn't seem like anything too special. But the moment you realize how much work and intention went into that charred material, it starts to feel like a mini revolution. Burning bark was no casual thing. It was a ritual. The process itself was a blend of practicality and symbolism, both an art and a science. You weren't just making ink, you were connecting with your environment in a way that few people today would ever understand. Imagine staring at a piece of charred bark, carefully grinding it down, mixing it with a few other elements, and then using it to write stories and history that could last centuries. Historians still argue whether early West African scribes used different types of tree bark, depending on the region, or if the mix of elements used in the ink changed over time. Either way, it's clear that these scribes weren't just scribbling for the sake of it. Each mark on a page or wall carried weight, sometimes literally, as the ink could vary in thickness depending on the recipe, making some writing more permanent, and others more faded with time. By this time, the importance of written communication was becoming clear. In the bustling cities of the West African empires, scribes were among the most respected individuals. They didn't just write for kings and queens. They documented everything from historical events to religious texts and even mathematical knowledge. The creation of ink was the gateway to keeping records, preserving laws, and making sure that nothing was lost. You might think, that sounds like a lot of effort just to get ink right. Well, you're not wrong, But there's something fascinating about the idea of creating your own tools, your own medium. We've all become accustomed to clicking buy now on Amazon. But what if you had to create the ink, carve your own pen, and even make your own paper? That's exactly what West African scribes did. It wasn't just about the writing. It was about the craft, the skill, and the patience. The bark of trees once gathered was carefully burned in controlled fires. It wasn't about getting a charred, burnt pile of nothing, no. It had to be just right. The ashes mixed with water, and sometimes a few other natural ingredients. Think plant-based oils or minerals formed the ink. The texture was perfect for writing on animal skins or palm leaves, materials commonly used by scribes in those days. As you can imagine, it was a painstaking process, each step calculated. One small misstep, and the ink could end up either too thin, too thick, or just plain unusable. But when it was right, when it was right, it was magic. So there's a certain level of reverence here, right? We're talking about a craft that required dedication and knowledge of both the land and the materials. It wasn't just make some ink and go on with your day. No, this was a ritualistic practice that connected the scribe to their ancestors, the spirits, and the very soil they walked on. You can almost imagine the focus these scribes had as they crafted their ink, the hum of the world around them fading. As they worked in silence, the faint smell of burnt bark lingering in the air. Before we move on, let me leave you with something to think about. You're in a place, a time where the written word is just starting to take form, and the very ink that will preserve history is created by hand. How different does your world seem now? Take a second to imagine being one of those scribes, your fingers stained with that burnt black ink, creating something that would outlive you by hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. As you continue your journey into the world of West African scribes, imagine that you're not just a passive observer. You're standing alongside the scribes themselves, watching as they carve symbols and letters onto the ancient manuscripts. The role of the scribe in this era wasn't just about writing. It was about guardianship. These scribes were the keepers of knowledge, not just scribblers of text. If you had lived in a West African kingdom like Mali, Songhai, or Ghana, the scribes would have been among the most respected people in the society. But here's the thing. The act of writing wasn't simply about documenting things for the sake of documentation. Oh no. It was so much more. Scribes were tasked with preserving the very identity of the kingdom. These weren't your average school teachers or librarians. They were essentially the living embodiment of the kingdom's history and culture. Without scribes, the complex histories of these empires might have been lost to time, their accomplishments fading into the sands of history. Now think about this for a second. Without the scribes, who would have been able to record the rich, deep cultural stories of the African continent, without them, who would have written the chronicles of kings and warriors, or the sacred laws passed down from generation to generation? Without scribes, much of what we know about the greatness of these civilizations would be lost, and that's a scary thought. Historians still debate how early the role of the scribe evolved in West Africa. Some say it began with the ancient kingdom of Ghana, while others argue it wasn't until the Mali Empire began its rise that the full institutionalization of scribes took place. Either way, one thing is clear. By the time Mali's golden age rolled around, scribes were indispensable to the maintenance of order, knowledge, and culture. Their responsibilities were vast. They wrote religious texts, recorded the deeds of kings, preserved legal codes, and transcribed oral traditions that had been passed down for generations. Scribes had to be meticulous, precise, and above all deeply trusted by the ruling elite. They held a unique position, a bridge between the oral and written traditions, between the past and the future. And in some ways, their role was sacred, almost priestly in nature. What makes their role even more fascinating is that the scribes didn't just create written words, they helped create the very framework that would govern these kingdoms. Imagine that your job is not only to record history, but also to create it. Your ink-stained hands are preserving the law's religious beliefs and ideas that will shape the lives of future generations. That's some heavy responsibility. But beyond the high-stakes world of royal decrees and laws, scribes were also the caretakers of a more personal form of history, the stories of the people. West African societies were built on oral traditions, and the scribes were the ones who wrote them down, transforming stories that had been passed down through spoken word into permanent, tangible records. These stories, legends, folk tales, myths, and histories were the lifeblood of the community, carrying wisdom lessons and traditions from one generation to the next. Without scribes, many of these stories would have vanished over time, lost to the inevitable fading of memory. It's not all ancient scrolls and grand histories, though. The life of a scribe wasn't easy. For one thing, you had to be incredibly well-versed in the languages of your kingdom, whether that was Arabic, a language that spread with the influence of Islam, or the local languages used in the region. Scribes had to understand not just the written word, but the cultural nuances behind those words. It wasn't just about scribbling symbols or letters. It was about conveying the right meaning tone and even emotion through the written form. To give you an idea of how crucial their work was, let's zoom in on the famous city of Timbuktu, a true center of learning in the medieval world. Scribes in Timbuktu didn't just work for the kings. They were also hired by merchants, scholars, and students, each seeking to preserve or share knowledge. And because Timbuktu was a hub for trade and culture, it attracted some of the finest scribes, whose work would later inspire generations of scholars across Africa and the world. But it wasn't just about the big names in history. The scribes who served the common people were just as important. Imagine that you're a farmer or a merchant struggling to make ends meet. You come to the scribe with a petition, a request, or even a love letter. Hey, scribes wrote those too. It's the scribe who turns your thoughts into formal words, elevating your voice in a world that often didn't listen to the humble or the poor. Historians still argue whether scribes in ancient West Africa were more closely aligned with religious leaders or political figures. Was their role more spiritual, acting as intermediaries between the gods and the people? Or was it more practical, ensuring that the kingdoms ran smoothly? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Scribes were spiritual guides, in the sense that they were the ones who wrote down religious texts, prayers, and sacred stories. Yet they were also highly practical figures, recording contracts, treaties, and laws that governed the daily lives of the kingdom's people. And then, of course, there's the sheer skill involved in being a scribe. We're not just talking about writing. Anyone can copy a sentence. Scribes were trained in the intricate art of calligraphy, using their ink and tools to create beautiful flowing scripts. These weren't just functional marks, they were works of art, each letter or symbol drawn with precision and care. You could almost think of each document as a piece of cultural art, each stroke of ink, a representation of the scribe's own mastery and the importance of the message being conveyed. So as you're drifting off to sleep tonight, imagine being one of these scribes, the custodians of knowledge, your hands stained with ink as you preserve your world's most important stories. It wasn't just a job. It was a vocation, a calling to ensure that the wisdom and history of your people would never be lost. Let's take a step back and think about the bigger picture for a moment. The ink these West African scribes created didn't just serve practical purposes. It became an integral part of communication and culture. Now, this might seem obvious today. We have ink everywhere, in every color, style, and form, thanks to the technological marvels of mass production. But in ancient West Africa, ink wasn't just something you grabbed off a shelf. It was something sacred, something that bridged the gap between the divine and the earthly. So why was ink such a big deal? Well, ink wasn't just a tool. It was the foundation of the written word itself. In a time when literacy was rare and reserved for an elite few, the act of writing carried immense power. It wasn't just about taking notes for yourself or writing down your grocery list. No, the written word could shape empires, preserve the word of the gods, and safeguard knowledge for generations to come. The very ink you used mattered. It was symbolic of the thoughts, history, and culture you were immortalizing. Historians still argue about the exact timeline of when writing and ink-making first appeared in West Africa. Some trace it back to the Kingdom of Ghana, while others point to the rise of the Mali Empire as the real turning point. Either way, by the time the Songhai Empire flourished, ink was not just a material, it was an instrument of power and prestige. The scribes who had access to it weren't just documenting life, they were creating it, preserving it, and ensuring that the stories of kings, warriors, and common folk alike would survive the test of time. Now, you might be wondering, where did all this ink come from, and how did they make it without the modern conveniences we take for granted? In fact, the process was a little more complicated than simply sticking a twig in a bottle of ink. West African scribes were deeply attuned to the natural world, and their ink came from a variety of surprising sources. Charcoal from burnt bark being one of the main ingredients. But it wasn't just about grabbing any old piece of bark and setting it on fire. Oh no, the process required a lot of care and attention. The bark was carefully selected from specific trees, often those that were already considered sacred or of symbolic importance. The trees themselves carried meaning, and using the bark from one of them to create ink was a kind of ritual in itself. The burnt bark would be ground into fine ash and then mixed with water, sometimes with added minerals or plant-based oils, to give the ink a smooth consistency. The result? A rich, dark ink that could be used to inscribe everything from religious texts to historical records, legal documents, to personal correspondence. But here's where it gets interesting. While many empires across the world relied on similar techniques for ink making, West African scribes had a unique twist. They didn't just make ink for the sake of it. For them, the ink was deeply tied to their identity. It wasn't simply about being able to write. It was about preserving culture, religion, and wisdom. The ink, when applied to animal skin or palm leaves, wasn't just a medium. It was the vessel for passing down knowledge from one generation to the next. The ink itself became a symbol of continuity, a representation of the unbroken chain of history and tradition. Historians still debate how widespread the practice of creating ink from burnt bark was across different regions of West Africa. Some believe it was a central practice for the Mali Empire, while others argue it was more common in rural areas, where scribes often worked alone or in smaller groups. Regardless, it's clear that the ability to make ink was an essential skill for any serious scribe. You could have all the tools in the world, but without the right ink, you couldn't preserve a single story. The use of ink also raised the stakes for scribes themselves. Writing wasn't just a matter of skill, it was a form of artistry. West African scribes were experts in calligraphy, and the way they wrote was as important as what they wrote. They crafted each letter with care, each stroke of ink a deliberate expression of their knowledge and expertise. The beauty of the script was as much a part of the message as the words themselves. Think of it like this. When a scribe wrote out a document, whether it was a letter, a law code, or a historical record, they weren't just writing words on a page. They were creating an object of lasting value, something that could be handed down through generations. The elegance of the writing was just as important as the content, if not more so. Imagine the pride that must have come with each document, each scroll carefully inscribed in that rich, dark ink. The ink didn't just preserve words, it gave them weight, meaning, and dignity. But the process wasn't all about fine-tuning the aesthetics of a document. It was also about the message being conveyed. The scribes weren't just telling stories, they were shaping the future. They recorded the lives of kings and queens, the battles fought, the treaties signed. They preserved the wisdom of the elders and captured the thoughts of philosophers. The ink they used was the tool that turned these ephemeral moments into eternal records. If you think about it, the invention of ink in this context wasn't just about writing. It was about the preservation of a culture, a people, and an entire way of life. It was the key to preserving the oral histories that had been passed down for generations, ensuring that the future could know the past. And perhaps that's the most striking thing about the ink. These scribes created, it wasn't just a functional tool. It was a bridge between the present and the past, a lifeline that connected the people of West Africa to their ancestors and to their descendants. So as you let your mind wander tonight, take a moment to think about the ink you're using in your own life. What stories are you preserving? What legacies are you leaving behind? And more importantly, what connections are you making between the past and the future? It's a question that connects us all to the ancient scribes of West Africa, who worked tirelessly, with care and reverence, to ensure their stories would never be forgotten. Now that you're getting a sense of the significance of ink and writing in West Africa, let's zoom out a little and explore where exactly all of this ink-making came from. If you think about the world of ancient scribes, it's easy to imagine them working in quiet, dimly lit rooms, surrounded by the smells of burnt bark and the faint sounds of grinding stone. But while the ink they created was crucial, it didn't come out of nowhere. West African scribes were masters of a much larger process, one that started with the natural world around them. Think about the environment for a moment. If you're in the heart of West Africa, you're likely surrounded by a dense forest with towering trees, thick vegetation, and a warm, almost humid atmosphere. The land itself is alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the calls of birds, the occasional roar of distant wildlife. In this environment, The materials needed for ink making didn't just appear by magic. They had to be carefully sourced with knowledge passed down through generations. These scribes weren't just artists or scribblers, they were experts in their surroundings. The most important material for the ink, the bark of certain trees. The trees themselves were selected not just for their abundance, but for their specific qualities. You might picture a scribe going into the forest, searching for a tree with thick, smooth bark, the kind that would burn evenly to produce fine charcoal when it was set on fire. And it wasn't just any tree that would do. The trees from which bark was harvested often had spiritual or cultural significance to the communities in which the scribes lived. These trees weren't just tools of the trade, they were part of the very fabric of the community's identity. Historians still argue over the specific trees that were used for ink production in West Africa. Some say the sacred baobab tree was commonly used for this purpose, with its bark being especially prized for its ability to yield a fine ash when burnt. Others suggest that trees with softer barks like the acacia might have been more commonly used as they would burn in a controlled manner, giving the scribe a reliable source of ink every time. But whatever the tree was, it was chosen with care. You didn't just grab a random branch. This was a deliberate, thought-out process. Once the right bark was selected, it was time for the scribe to begin the ritual of burning it. The process wasn't as simple as tossing the bark into a fire and walking away. No, it was a careful art in itself. The bark had to be charred evenly, which meant controlling the heat of the fire. Too little, and the bark wouldn't burn well enough to create the right kind of charcoal. Too much, and it could turn to ash too quickly, leaving behind nothing but dust. The scribe had to watch carefully, making adjustments to the fire as needed, all while keeping an eye on the materials. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just about creating charcoal. Once the bark had been burnt to perfection, it was scraped and ground into fine powder. The ink-making process wasn't just about grabbing some ashes and mixing them with water. It was about refining those ashes into the right texture, a texture that would work well on the materials scribes wrote on, whether it was animal skin palm leaves or even parchment. The ink had to be smooth enough to spread evenly, but dense enough to leave a strong mark. This delicate process was more than just a science. It was an art. A scribe didn't just make ink to get the job done. They crafted the ink, each batch a reflection of their knowledge, skill, and connection to the natural world. When you take a moment to think about it, it's almost like the scribe was in conversation with the forest. The trees provided the material, the fire created the ink, and the scribe gave it life by writing with it. It was a circular, interconnected process, and it all began with the natural world. And this wasn't something that could be rushed. You couldn't just get ink instantly. The entire process, from selecting the bark to burning it, grinding the ashes, and mixing the ink, could take days, if not longer, depending on the quality of the material and the time needed to perfect the ink. This means that scribes weren't just creating ink on a whim. They were making ink with care, precision, and patience, understanding that every batch of ink had to be perfect in order to preserve history in the way it deserved. But the bark wasn't the only natural material that scribes worked with. There were other elements involved in the creation of ink elements that came straight from the land. For example, sometimes minerals were added to the ink to help it set better, or to add color and depth. Iron gall ink made from tannin-rich galls found on trees was used in various parts of the world, and in some West African regions, a similar concept was applied. The use of minerals helped the ink last longer and ensured it would be readable for centuries to come. Historians still argue whether the West African scribes used purely organic materials for their ink, or if they also incorporated mineral-based elements, like iron, into their recipes. Some believe the use of minerals was largely restricted to specific regions, while others think it was a widespread practice. Either way, the point remains that these scribes were resourceful, using everything the land had to offer to create something that could preserve their world's stories, ideas, and laws. Now think about this. It's hard to imagine today how much effort went into something as simple as ink. In a world where a quick click on Amazon brings ink to your doorstep, it's easy to forget that creating ink used to be an intricate, thoughtful process, one tied to the land and to culture. West African scribes didn't just use ink as a tool, they honored it, understanding that it was their link to the past and their contribution to the future. As you settle into sleep, remember this: the next time you sit down to write something, whether it's a note, a letter, or a shopping list, think about the incredible journey that ink has been on, from the bark of sacred trees, through the hands of ancient scribes, to the page you're writing on. Now ink has carried the weight of history, and you, in your own way, are a part of that story. Let's pause for a moment right in the middle of this journey and think about what's going on. The ancient West African scribes didn't just make ink from burnt bark and mineral mixtures. They were also shaping the very framework of society itself. Their ink wasn't just used to write down decrees, treaties, or royal histories. It was used to create order, to enforce laws, and to communicate messages that defined a civilization. Imagine for a second you're in the bustling heart of an ancient West African empire, perhaps Mali or Songhai. The sun is setting, casting an orange glow across the streets. Merchants are still peddling their wares, but the scribes are hard at work, hunched over their scrolls, their fingers stained with the rich ink they've carefully prepared. Their work isn't just for the king or the elite. Their writing is what keeps the kingdom running. The scribes wrote down contracts between traders, preserving the details of agreements that could make or break someone's business. They penned down the royal decrees, ensuring that everyone in the kingdom knew the law, whether they were in the capital or in a distant village. And perhaps most crucially, they recorded the events and decisions that shaped the future of the empire, preserving them for posterity. One of the most fascinating things about the West African scribes is that they weren't simply preserving history, they were creating history. Their written words didn't just reflect what had happened, they shaped how people would remember it. You can think of these scribes as the original historians, the first to give a concrete form to the fluid, ever-changing nature of history. What they chose to write down, and how they chose to write it, could determine the legacy of a king, the fate of an empire, or the survival of a cultural tradition. But their role wasn't just political or legal. The scribes were also tasked with recording the oral traditions that had been passed down for centuries. In an oral culture like that of West Africa, stories were everything: histories, legends, morals, and teachings, all lived in the spoken word. The role of the scribe was to take those stories and give them permanence, ensuring that they would never fade away. And the importance of this task can't be overstated. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were the foundation of West African societies. They taught values, offered wisdom, and connected people to their ancestors. Historians still debate the exact nature of the oral tradition. In West Africa, was it more of a spontaneous performance or a highly structured form of storytelling? Some believe it was largely improvisational, with each storyteller adding their own flair, while others argue that there was a strict system in place, with rules and formal structures that governed how stories were passed down. Either way, it's clear that these stories were seen as sacred, and the scribes were entrusted with preserving them for future generations. But here's where things get even more interesting. In many West African societies, the scribes weren't just writing down what had already been said. They were also creating new versions of old stories. The art of the scribe wasn't just about transcription. It was about interpretation. They could take a story told by a griot, a respected oral historian, and rework it, refine it, or even change parts of it to fit the needs of the present moment. This power to interpret and reshape history was enormous. It's almost like the scribes had the power to write their own future literally. Think about that for a second. The scribes weren't just passive recorders. They had agency. The ink they wrote with could change the future. They could write about the past, but they could also bend the future to fit their vision. That's a pretty wild thought, isn't it? Every time a scribe picked up a quill or brush, they were part of a living, breathing history. Their words weren't just a reflection of reality. They were an active part of shaping it. Now consider the challenge of being a scribe in this environment. Imagine being the one responsible for recording the events of the day, knowing that what you wrote could impact generations to come. What if you made a mistake? What if you accidentally misrepresented a royal figure or omitted an important detail? The stakes were incredibly high, and that kind of pressure must have been immense. But the scribes were well aware of this responsibility, and they approached their work with reverence. They didn't just write for practical purposes. They saw their work as sacred. What's even more fascinating is the way that West African scribes combined different traditions into their writing. While they often used Arabic thanks to the influence of Islam, they also maintained and adapted their own indigenous languages and scripts. One example of this is the use of the Ajami script, a version of the Arabic alphabet adapted to write local African languages. This allowed the scribes to keep the essence of their own languages and traditions alive, while also incorporating the powerful new writing system that came with Islam. Historians still debate the exact origins of Ajami. Some believe it was an early form of linguistic resistance, a way to keep African languages alive in the face of Islamic and colonial pressures. Others see it as a tool of cultural fusion, combining the best of both worlds. Either way, it's clear that Ajami was a product of the creative, adaptive spirit of the scribes, who weren't just passive recipients of foreign influence, but active creators of their own culture. The scribes didn't just use Arabic for religious texts. They adapted it to fit their own needs, creating a unique, culturally specific form of writing. In this way, scribes played a crucial role in the spread of Islam in West Africa, but they didn't just adopt the religion. They shaped it in their own image. They created a writing tradition that was deeply tied to their identity, a tradition that combined the sacred and the practical, the oral and the written, the old and the new. The scribes of West Africa weren't just historians. They were architects of their own cultural destiny. So as you lie in bed tonight, think about the incredible responsibility these scribes carried. They weren't just documenting their world, they were actively shaping it. and every stroke of ink they made was a step in the creation of history itself. It's almost as if by writing, they were bringing their world into being one word at a time. Now that you've got a sense of the scribe's responsibility, let's take a moment to think about how exactly these writings traveled. It's one thing to create ink and to write. It's another to ensure that those writings have the chance to live on, to circulate, and to be shared. And that's where something fascinating about West African scribes comes into play. Their ability to share knowledge didn't just rely on their own hands. It was about community networks. And oddly enough, the way geography itself influenced the spread of written knowledge. Picture this. You're in one of the great empires of West Africa, say, the Mali Empire. The king has just decreed something important, maybe a new law or a new trade agreement, and the scribes have been busy writing it down, as you already know. But what happens next? How does that decree get out into the wider world? The answer lies in the extensive network of trade routes communication systems, and of course, the griots, the living storytellers who played a crucial role in carrying these messages. You see, while scribes wrote down important records and texts, the real magic happened when that knowledge was disseminated throughout the empire and beyond. West Africa, especially, during the medieval period, was a hub for long-distance trade that connected not only different regions within Africa, but also the rest of the world, including Europe and the Middle East. From the trans-Saharan trade routes to the coastal routes that reached out to the Mediterranean and the Arabian Peninsula, West Africa was a crossroads of cultures, ideas, and importantly, texts. Historians still argue about the exact role of written communication in this network. Did written texts actually travel as widely as oral traditions did? Or was oral transmission still the main way information was spread? Some scholars point to the trade routes as a major vehicle for written knowledge, while others suggest that oral storytelling was in fact far more effective at carrying messages across long distances. Both sides have valid points. The reality likely lies somewhere in between. On one hand, written documents certainly had their place. Imagine a merchant coming from Timbuktu, which was a renowned center of learning, loaded with scrolls of written knowledge. That merchant might meet up with a fellow trader from Morocco or Egypt and exchange not just goods, but also ideas passing along decrees, religious texts, or business contracts written in ink. The ability to send written documents via trade routes created a kind of literary diaspora, if you will. The ink on those pieces of paper or leather or bark became a way to cross not just physical space, but also cultural and intellectual boundaries. On the other hand, though, you have the griots, those masterful oral historians and storytellers, who carried knowledge across the land with their words alone. They didn't need ink or parchment to spread the message, and this is where things get really interesting. Griots would memorize entire epics, genealogies, and stories of the kings, which were passed down through generations. As much as we're focused on the written word in this discussion, we can't forget that these stories were also written in the minds of the griots who would perform them for audiences far and wide. So while written texts certainly had a role, the power of the spoken word should not be underestimated. Now let's get back to the scribes. The written word wasn't just something that sat in libraries and archives collecting dust. The scribes of West Africa were actively involved in a process of literary exchange. For instance, during the height of the Mali Empire, you had scholars and scribes in cities like Timbuktu. who were creating manuscripts that would be copied and sent across the empire. These scribes didn't just sit in one place and wait for someone to come to them. They took their work to markets, religious centers, and other hubs of activity. If you were a merchant passing through one of these cities, you might stop at a local scribe's stall to get a document written or to learn about new religious or political developments. These scribes were at the crossroads of knowledge, connecting scholars, traders, and travelers from all corners of the empire. And speaking of Timbuktu, let's take a closer look at it, because it was the real beating heart of intellectual life in West Africa. Timbuktu wasn't just a center for trade. It was the intellectual capital of the Mali Empire. Its libraries were filled with thousands of manuscripts, covering everything from astronomy to law, history, to theology. The city attracted scholars from across Africa and beyond, who would come to exchange ideas, learn, and copy texts. The scribes of Timbuktu were more than just writers. They were at the forefront of a vibrant intellectual exchange. They weren't just passively recording history. They were actively creating it, playing a role in shaping the intellectual landscape of the entire region. Historians still argue over the extent to which Timbuktu's fame was tied to its manuscripts. Some view it as the Harvard of its time, a center of learning where the brightest minds gathered to study and share ideas. Others argue that its fame is partly exaggerated, a romanticized vision of a city that was at its core a small, albeit influential trading town. But regardless of where the truth lies, what is clear is that Timbuktu and places like it were key hubs in a network that connected the written word with the rest of the world. Whether through manuscripts, oral stories, or scholarly debates, the exchange of knowledge was alive and well across West Africa, and it was driven in large part by the scribes. The ability to create, preserve, and share ink-based knowledge gave these scribes tremendous power, but it also placed them in a position of responsibility. What they wrote down didn't just circulate in their immediate environment. It had the potential to reach across vast distances, influencing people and cultures far beyond their home region. The scribes were both gatekeepers and connectors, standing at the intersection of local traditions and global exchanges, ensuring that the knowledge of West Africa didn't just stay within the confines of one kingdom. It was part of a much larger global conversation. So as you drift into sleep tonight, think about the ripple effects of the scribes' work. Their ink wasn't just used to record the past. It helped shape the future by spreading across borders, cultures, and continents. And while you may not be transcribing ancient manuscripts or memorizing epic poems, the way you share ideas and knowledge in the world today still echoes that same ancient impulse to communicate, to preserve, and to shape the world with the power of words. As you settle deeper into the story, you might be wondering, with all this talk of scribes, ink, and written records, what about the other materials they used to write on? After all, you don't just need ink and tools. You need a surface to put that ink onto. And in ancient West Africa, scribes didn't have the convenience of pre-made paper like we do today. They had to get creative, turning local materials into surfaces fit for their important work. One of the most important materials was parchment, but it wasn't just any parchment. It had to be carefully prepared. The preparation process for parchment, which involved the skin of goats, sheep, or cows, was no small feat. It wasn't a simple case of stretching out the skin and letting it dry. No, it had to be scraped and cleaned, often treated with ash, or other natural substances to ensure it would be smooth enough for writing. The tanning process was delicate and needed to be done carefully to preserve the integrity of the material. Too much treatment, and the skin could tear or lose its smooth texture. Too little, and it would be too stiff to write on. But parchment wasn't the only material available. Palm leaves were also a popular option, especially in the southern parts of West Africa. They were used widely in the early periods of written history and had the added benefit of being relatively abundant in the tropical climates. Palm leaves could be cut into long strips, and once dried, they provided a flexible yet durable surface for scribes to write on. To make the palm leaves easier to write on, scribes would sometimes scratch the surface lightly with a sharp object, creating faint lines that would guide their writing. Historians still debate the exact role of palm leaves versus parchment in the scribal practices of West Africa. Some argue that parchment was preferred because it was more durable and could last longer, perfect for recording important royal decrees or religious texts that needed to survive for generations. Others believe that palm leaves were used more for temporary or everyday writing, as they were easier to obtain and prepare. But regardless of the material, both palm leaves and parchment had one thing in common. They required the care and attention of the scribe to ensure they would hold up to the demands of written language, and it didn't end there. There were also instances where scribes used wooden tablets, particularly in the more northern regions of West Africa, where trade with the Arab world was more common. These tablets were often coated with a thin layer of wax, creating a smooth surface on which a scribe could carve or write with a stylus. The beauty of the wooden tablet was its reuse. If a scribe made an error or wanted to change something, they could simply melt the wax and start over. This made it a convenient option for shorter-term records or drafts that would eventually be copied onto a more permanent surface. Now, you might be wondering how exactly these materials were used once prepared. Well, the scribe's toolkit was more than just ink. They often had a collection of pens or writing tools crafted from various materials. Some scribes used quills made from the feathers of birds, while others employed reeds or brushes. The type of pen they used depended largely on the surface they were writing on. For example, a reed pen might be used for palm leaves, while a brush could be more effective for writing on smooth parchment. The key was that each writing tool was chosen with care, ensuring the ink would flow properly and produce clear, legible markings. There's a certain elegance to this process, isn't there? The scribes weren't just putting ink on paper. They were selecting every element, each surface, each pen, each stroke with precision. It was almost like the act of writing itself became a meditation, a way of respecting the material world around them. But what's truly fascinating is that in many ways, the writing materials and tools of West African scribes were deeply tied to their environment. The bark, the parchment, the palm leaves, all of these were drawn from the natural world, and their use reflected the close relationship between the people and the land. The scribes were not just intellectuals. They were also skilled craftsmen, able to turn simple materials into vehicles for the written word. Each material they used had a story, a process, and a connection to the environment that gave it life. Historians still argue whether these materials, especially parchment and palm leaves, were more widely used in religious or secular contexts. Some suggest that sacred texts, particularly those associated with Islam, were more likely to be written on parchment as it was seen as a more prestigious and durable option. On the other hand, secular or everyday documents might have been written on more practical materials, like palm leaves, which could be produced in greater quantities. This distinction between the sacred and the mundane also reflects the way the scribes viewed their work. While the sacred texts were treated with reverence and care, the secular works, deeds, contracts, and so on were no less important. As they formed the backbone of the society, the scribes were helping to preserve. Interestingly, the ability to create and manage such materials wasn't something reserved for the scribes alone. The people involved in the preparation of the writing surfaces, tanners, palm leaf gatherers, and woodworkers, were all part of the larger community. The entire process of writing, from the gathering of materials to the final product, was a communal effort. The scribes might have had the final say on what went onto the page, but they were part of a larger network of people who made their work possible. And here's a curious thought. As the scribes and their communities worked with these materials, they were also in a sense preserving the ecosystem around them. The trees, the palm leaves, and the animals were not just resources to be consumed. They were part of a system and interconnected web of life that sustained the scribe's craft. In this way, writing wasn't just an intellectual act. It was also an act of stewardship, a way of respecting the resources that made it all possible. So as you lay back and let the weight of the world drift away, imagine the scribes at work again, carefully selecting their parchment, crafting their pens, and applying ink to the surfaces they prepared. Every single element, every stroke of ink, every word written was a part of a larger living process. The written word wasn't just about preserving knowledge. It was about connecting people to the land, to their communities, and to their shared history. Let's take a moment to reflect on the true significance of ink in the ancient West African world. It wasn't just a tool for scribes to record history or preserve knowledge. It was also a symbol of power, of authority, and perhaps most profoundly of transformation. The act of writing with ink, especially ink made from burnt bark, was more than just a practical step. It was a ritual. Each stroke of the pen didn't simply represent the transfer of words from the mind to the page. It was a physical manifestation of the invisible power of knowledge itself. When you think about it, the process of making ink, combining the carbon from burnt bark with water, and sometimes even adding minerals or plant extracts, feels almost like alchemy. The scribes weren't just mixing ingredients. They were performing a kind of magic, creating something new out of the old. The burning of the bark itself was a form of transformation, turning the raw material into something that could carry meaning. That ink became a bridge between the present moment and the timeless past, between the material world and the world of ideas. The importance of ink cannot be overstated. In a world without the printing press or mass communication, ink was one of the few ways people could communicate ideas across space and time. Once a message was written down, it could be shared, copied, and transported over vast distances. Ink, in a sense, made history permanent. Without ink, without the ability to write, societies would have remained in the realm of oral tradition, vibrant, dynamic, but also fleeting. Ink was what allowed history to be fixed in time, allowing future generations to learn from the past. But here's where it gets a little more intriguing. The ink used by West African scribes was not just about the words it carried, it was about the very act of writing itself. For many cultures, the power of written language was seen as divine, In ancient Egypt, for instance, the god Thoth was the deity of writing and knowledge, and scribes were seen as his earthly agents. Similarly, in West Africa, the scribes were often revered as powerful figures who had access to hidden knowledge that could shape empires and change the course of history. Now consider this. The ink wasn't just an intellectual tool. It was also a physical manifestation of that power. It wasn't just ink. It was a symbol of authority. The very act of applying ink to parchment or palm leaves meant that something was being set in stone, literally. The decree you wrote down today would be passed on tomorrow, not just in speech, but in writing. Your words would have a lasting effect. You weren't just jotting down an idea. You were making something official, something that would withstand the test of time. Historians still debate how deeply the concept of written authority was embedded in the fabric of West African societies. Some scholars argue that the role of the scribe was almost priestly in nature, given that writing itself was such a revered activity. Others contend that while writing was certainly important, the spoken word still held a more prominent place in the culture. After all, the griots who were experts in the oral traditions played just as crucial a role in maintaining the historical memory of the people. What's clear, though, is that there was a deep respect for written texts, and this respect likely extended to the ink that made those texts possible. Imagine now, for a moment, that you're a royal scribe. You've just received an important royal order, and it's your task to record it. This isn't just any order. It's a decree that will change the lives of everyone in the kingdom. The king has decided to build a new palace, and that's going to require a great deal of coordination with local merchants, artisans, and laborers. Your job is to write down the specifics of this decree, ensuring that everyone in the kingdom receives the message. The ink on your parchment isn't just a way of getting the message across. It's an authoritative record that will stand the test of time. People will consult this text for years to come, ensuring that the palace is built exactly as planned. Think about the weight of that responsibility. The ink you're using is more than just a means of communication. It's the embodiment of the king's will. It's the physical proof of his authority. And you, as the scribe, are the one who wields that authority. You have the power to ensure that the message is recorded correctly, and in doing so, you've become part of a larger process of governance, law, and history. Your work, though seemingly simple, holds immense power because it ensures the continuity of the king's vision. This sense of power carried with the ink was particularly important in the case of royal decrees and legal codes. When a scribe wrote down the law, that law wasn't just an idea or a spoken command. It became something real. It became concrete, enforceable, and permanent. And it was this permanence that made writing and ink so powerful. The power of ink in this sense wasn't just intellectual or cultural. It was political. It gave rulers and scribes a means to enact and sustain authority over vast territories. Interestingly, the ink itself wasn't always just black. While burnt bark often produced a dark ink, some scribes used other materials to create different colors of ink. In some cases, red ink was used to mark important passages or to underline key sections of a text. This use of color added an extra layer of meaning to the writing. Red ink, for example, could indicate something urgent or vital, something that required attention. It was like a visual cue, a way of guiding the reader's eye to the most important parts of the text. Historians still argue about the full extent of this practice, Was red ink commonly used for legal or religious texts, or was it reserved for special occasions? Some scholars point to the use of colored ink as evidence of a sophisticated system of written communication where the visual presentation of a text was just as important as its content. Others suggest that the use of colored inks may have been less about symbolism and more about practicality, making certain sections stand out for easy reference. In either case, what's undeniable is that ink, whether black or red, was central to the communication of power, knowledge, and authority. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The very thing that allowed the scribes to communicate with others across space and time also gave them the means to preserve the past, to communicate the future, and to assert control over the present. So as you get ready to slip deeper into sleep, imagine the world of ink around you, the scribe dipping their pen into that dark ink, creating not just words on a page, but symbols of power, of authority, of history itself. Each drop of ink wasn't just a mark. It was a bridge, a doorway to the past, a pathway to the future, and it all started with something as simple yet profound as a burned piece of bark. As you sink further into this world of scribes and ink, let's turn our attention to the societal impact of the written word. It's easy to think of scribes as solitary figures hunched over their manuscripts, creating art for the elite. But the reality was much more dynamic. Scribes didn't just work in isolation. They were at the very heart of the social and political fabric of West African kingdoms. Their role as intermediaries between the rulers and the people, the sacred and the secular, was crucial to the function of these societies. Picture this. You're in the heart of the Mali Empire, around the 14th century, during the reign of Mansa Musa. This is a time when West Africa was at its height, when gold flowed through the markets, and Timbuktu was a beacon of learning and culture. In the midst of all this, the scribes were working busy at their desks, ensuring that royal decrees, trade contracts, and religious edicts were recorded. They weren't just writing for the sake of writing. They were writing to keep order, to document the empire's vast wealth, to ensure that people knew the laws, the taxes, and the rights that bound them together. It's easy to picture the image of the scribe as an academic or a scholar, hunched over parchment in quiet contemplation. But the scribes were in fact mediators. They didn't simply record information for posterity. They ensured the smooth functioning of society. Without their ink, there would have been no official contracts between traders, no written evidence of diplomatic agreements, and no lasting records of royal decrees. In essence, the scribes helped create a system of legal continuity, a lasting foundation upon which the empire could grow and flourish. Historians still argue about the exact nature of the scribe's role. Was it primarily clerical, or was it deeply political? Some suggest that the scribes were closely tied to the royal court, acting almost as advisors, while others believe they were more neutral figures, simply documenting whatever came their way. Either way, one thing is clear. The scribes were indispensable to the smooth operation of West African empires. Their work wasn't just about preserving knowledge, it was about ensuring the empire's infrastructure remained intact. Take a moment to imagine the political side of things. Imagine that you're a trader traveling through the Sahel, heading toward the great city of Gao. You're carrying precious commodities like gold salt and textiles, and you need to make sure that when you arrive, you can conduct your business smoothly. You'll need documents, trade contracts, legal agreements, perhaps even proof of your goods' origin. Without the scribes to produce these records, your goods might be questioned, your journey delayed. The scribes' ink created a system of trust, allowing people from different cultures and regions to come together and trade without constantly fearing dishonesty or fraud. The scribes didn't just write royal orders. They also penned the rules of commerce, the details of social contracts, and even the stories of their own lives. West African societies were deeply invested in the creation and transmission of knowledge, and the written word was the key to that. Without it, history would have been told only by word of mouth, each story morphing and changing with every retelling. With ink, history could be fixed and preserved solidified on the page, ready to be passed down to future generations in its truest form. And what about those stories? While the written word played a crucial role in politics and commerce, it was also a vessel for the rich oral traditions of West Africa. In many cases, the scribes weren't just copying texts. They were helping preserve the oral histories that had been passed down for generations. The griots, those revered storytellers, would recite epic poems, genealogies, and the deeds of heroes, and the scribes would transcribe them into written form. What's fascinating here is how these oral stories were melded with written language, creating a bridge between two different ways of preserving knowledge. This fusion of the spoken and the written gave West African societies a unique way of maintaining their history, blending the old with the new. But of course, not everyone could read or write. The ability to read a manuscript or interpret a royal decree wasn't something that was widely accessible to the general population. Literacy in West Africa, much like elsewhere in the world at the time, was largely confined to the elite. But that didn't mean the written word had no influence on everyday people. For one, the scribes often played an intermediary role, reading written documents aloud to those who couldn't read for themselves. In this way, the scribes were not only intellectuals, they were communicators, spreading knowledge and maintaining social order by making sure that written information reached its intended audience, regardless of their literacy level. This connection between the elite and the common people is important. While the scribes were working with the ruling class, ensuring that documents were properly written and recorded, their work still had far-reaching consequences. The power of ink was not just reserved for the elite. It was something that eventually trickled down to the everyday person. Imagine a merchant who has a legal document validating their trade deal. That piece of parchment written in ink by a scribe has the power to protect them. It guarantees their rights in the eyes of the law, something that could impact their livelihood. The scribes then weren't just recording history. They were empowering people, making sure that even the lowliest merchant could participate in the greater legal and political structures of society. In fact, there's something almost democratic about the scribal process. Even though the scribes were working on behalf of kings and nobles, their work ultimately served the greater good. They were the ones who helped ensure that society functioned smoothly. Their ink wasn't just for the wealthy or the powerful. It was for everyone who depended on written documents to maintain their place in society, whether they were traders, farmers, or artisans. The scribes were in many ways the unsung architects of a stable society. Historians still debate whether scribes in their work helped reinforce the power structures of their societies, or whether they had the ability to challenge those structures. Some argue that scribes were just tools of the elite, their work reinforcing existing hierarchies. Others believe that scribes had more agency than we give them credit for, that through their control of knowledge, they could influence royal decisions or even challenge the status quo. What's undeniable is that the written word had power, and the scribes were the ones who held the keys to it. So as you continue to drift off, consider this: the ink, the parchment, the scribes. They were all part of a system that connected the dots between the political, social, and economic realms. They weren't just writing words. They were writing history, shaping the future, and connecting people across time and space. And in a way, they were doing something we're all still doing today: communicating, sharing, and leaving our mark on the world. As you're getting deeper into this journey of West African scribes, you might start to wonder what happened to all these carefully crafted records, these important documents filled with ink from burnt bark, written on parchment and palm leaves. Where did they go? Did they survive the passage of time, or did they fade away into the dust of history? It's an interesting thought, because the durability of these documents wasn't guaranteed. Writing materials like palm leaves and parchment, no matter how carefully prepared, were still subject to decay. The ink, though magical in its own right, was susceptible to fading or smudging. While the stories and records were crucial at the time, not every text survived. Historians are still piecing together what was lost in the sands of time. That said, there were some remarkable instances where the scribes' works did endure, and in surprising places too. Take, for instance, the great libraries of Timbuktu. This city, often regarded as the heart of learning in medieval West Africa, was home to thousands of manuscripts, many of them written by the very scribes we're learning about. The manuscripts housed there were filled with knowledge on everything from mathematics and astronomy to Islamic scholarship and medicine. And these weren't just royal decrees or legal contracts. They were filled with wisdom stories and ideas that were passed down from generation to generation. But the preservation of these texts wasn't as simple as just keeping them in a dusty library. In many cases, the manuscripts were kept under the watchful eye of scholars who understood their value. Timbuktu became a center not just for trade and diplomacy, but for the preservation of knowledge. Scholars and scribes alike made sure the manuscripts were carefully copied, kept safe, and made available to those who could read them. The ink on these manuscripts wasn't just a record. It was a repository of collective wisdom, carefully stored away for posterity. However, even the great libraries of Timbuktu weren't immune to the ravages of time. In the 16th century, when the Songhai Empire was invaded, many of these manuscripts were destroyed or looted. The city's libraries, which had once housed the knowledge of entire empires, were sacked. And yet somehow, a surprising number of manuscripts survived. It wasn't until the 20th century that the world began to truly appreciate just how many of these ancient texts had made it through the centuries. Historians still argue about how many of the original manuscripts from Timbuktu still exist today. Some claim that the majority of the manuscripts were lost to fire theft or neglect, while others believe that a significant number of texts were hidden away or smuggled out of the city before it was overtaken. The surviving manuscripts, now being digitized and cataloged, offer us a glimpse into a forgotten chapter of history. They stand as a testament to the resilience of knowledge, the endurance of the written word, and perhaps most importantly, the determination of the scribes, who made sure it all survived. But let's not romanticize the survival of these manuscripts too much, because for every text that survived, there were likely hundreds that were lost. Paper or parchment, no matter how durable it was made to be, could only withstand so much. The tropical climate with its humidity and heat took a toll on these ancient materials. And beyond the natural decay, there were the practical challenges of storing and securing so much knowledge in an unstable political environment. In many ways, the survival of written records in West Africa was as much about the environment and circumstances as it was about the will of the people to preserve them. Even today, the manuscripts of West Africa face threats. While some have been preserved in digital formats, the original manuscripts remain at risk from environmental degradation and political instability. In many cases, these manuscripts are still kept in private collections, handed down from generation to generation. They are the quiet survivors of a world that once depended on them for communication, governance, and history. Now let's zoom out for a moment and consider this. The act of preserving knowledge through writing was never just about keeping records. It was about passing on the story of a culture. The ink, the parchment, the palm leaves, they were more than just practical tools. They were vessels for memory bridges to the past. They weren't just holding information, they were holding identity. The ability to write things down wasn't just about preserving facts. It was about establishing a narrative, creating a shared history that could endure. The scribes of West Africa, in their quiet way, became the guardians of their people's stories. They helped craft the mythology of kingdoms, the legacies of kings and queens, and the very structure of society. They understood perhaps more than anyone that writing wasn't just a mechanical act. It was a way to construct meaning. They weren't just recording history, they were making history, and in doing so they were giving their people a legacy to hold on to. Historians still debate how much of West African history was written down compared to other regions in the world. While much of Western history in the pre-modern world was documented through the written word, West Africa relied heavily on oral traditions for the transmission of history, philosophy, and culture. The written word didn't entirely replace the spoken word in West Africa. It complemented it. The griots, who were masters of oral history, worked in tandem with the scribes to preserve their people's stories. Written manuscripts were important, but they didn't supersede the spoken tradition. In fact, the written texts often served as a supplement, a way to bolster and preserve the verbal narratives that were so central to West African life. This blending of oral and written traditions creates a fascinating dynamic one that allowed for a rich tapestry of culture and history to be woven together. The oral stories could evolve over time, but the written records offered a fixed point, a snapshot of history that could be consulted again and again. And yet both traditions, oral and written, serve the same purpose: to preserve the collective memory of the people. Imagine now being in the midst of this culture, a culture where the power of ink and the power of the spoken word worked together. You'd hear the griots reciting epic tales, their voices carrying through the air, while in the background, scribes were carefully copying down important documents in ink. Both practices worked in harmony, each giving the other its meaning. The power of knowledge wasn't just in what was written, it was in how it was shared, passed down, and remembered. So as you lay back, drifting closer to sleep, think of those scribes in Timbuktu and Mali, in all the great kingdoms of West Africa. the ink they used, the words they wrote, they're still here in a way. Their history passed down in books, manuscripts, and stories lives on. And in a way, their ink is still flowing, connecting the past to the present, one written word at a time. Now, as you slip even further into the world of ink, it's time to shift our focus to one of the more mysterious aspects of West African scribal culture, the secretive nature of the scribe's work. We've already touched on how ink was used to wield power, preserve knowledge, and create historical records. But there's a darker, more hidden side to the scribe's role in these ancient societies. Imagine for a moment that you're a scribe, say, in the heart of the kingdom, sitting at your wooden desk, carefully preparing your ink from the charred bark, dipping your quill into the inky blackness, and writing down the royal decree. But what if you weren't just writing history for the public to read? What if instead you were creating a document that wasn't meant to be seen by anyone else ever? What if you were creating something secret, something hidden, a document that would never be meant for the masses? You see, scribes often worked with sensitive material. Some of their written records were intended to remain sealed, known only to the elite or those with special clearance. Historians still argue about how common such secrecy was. In some cases, the scribes may have been privy to royal or religious information that could shake the foundations of the society if revealed. For example, the royal scribes could have been writing down the king's secret decrees or documenting the results of covert diplomatic negotiations with other kingdoms. In this case, the ink wasn't just a tool for preserving truth, it was also a tool for concealment. Historians debate the extent of this secrecy. Some argue that because of the central role the scribes played in transmitting knowledge, they were trusted with both public and private records, some of which might have been kept under lock and key. Others suggest that much of the written material was available to anyone who could read, with very few exceptions. What we do know, however, is that the scribes were key players in the transmission of knowledge, sometimes publicly and sometimes privately. The fact that some of their records were kept hidden makes their role even more intriguing. Take a moment to picture this. You're a royal scribe, and you've just received an order to write down a highly confidential message from the king to a distant ally. The message is so important, so potentially volatile, that it must be hidden from the public eye. You can't just jot it down and leave it lying around. You must ensure that it's protected from prying eyes, hidden away in a secret chamber, perhaps locked inside a scroll case. And even when the message reaches its destination, it's possible that only the most trusted individuals will be allowed to read it. The ink in this case doesn't just serve to communicate, it serves to protect. This secrecy didn't just apply to royal matters. Religious scribes, for instance, had their own unique set of responsibilities. In many cases, the scribes were tasked with transcribing sacred texts, religious doctrines, or even secret rituals that only a select group of people were allowed to understand. Religious ink, much like royal ink, had an added layer of significance. It wasn't just written for the eyes of the public. It was written for those with the proper initiation or training. The ink in these cases could be thought of as a gatekeeper, allowing only certain people access to hidden knowledge. Historians still debate how much of this secretive scribal work was tied to religious practices. Some suggest that the scribes in religious communities had their own closed systems of knowledge, where the ink they used to transcribe holy texts was considered sacred and imbued with divine power. Others believe that the scribes, like their royal counterparts, were simply doing their job recording whatever they were asked to, without necessarily attributing any greater spiritual significance to the ink itself. Still, the fact that some texts were kept secret and guarded so carefully suggests that ink had a far more complex role than simply transferring information. But the secrecy didn't always end well for everyone involved. Think of the risks a scribe faced when dealing with sensitive material. In a time of political upheaval, scribes could easily find themselves caught between factions, tasked with writing something for one side, while secretly sympathizing with another. What if a scribe was asked to write a decree that they felt was unjust or wrong? They might feel compelled to protect the document or hide it away, to prevent it from being used for harmful purposes. In some cases, scribes could find themselves in positions where their lives were at risk, caught between the conflicting demands of those in power. Some scribes might even have had to disappear certain documents, erasing them from history to prevent them from falling into the wrong hands. The power of ink in this case was as much about control as it was about communication. The fascinating thing is how these scribes, despite the secrecy of their work, still managed to leave their mark on history. Even the most hidden documents could influence the course of events. Imagine a royal decree, written in secret, stored away for years, and then discovered by a future ruler. It could offer insights into the political intrigues of a long-forgotten era, revealing hidden alliances, power struggles, or betrayals. Even in their secrecy, these scribes were shaping the future, leaving behind fragments of knowledge that would eventually be pieced together and studied by historians. The secrecy of scribal work also posed questions about the very nature of knowledge itself. What makes something public knowledge, and what makes it private? And how do scribes navigate the fine line between preserving knowledge for the greater good and protecting the secrets of those in power? These questions are still debated today, particularly when it comes to the role of government secrecy intelligence agencies and even corporate confidentiality. The scribes of West Africa, in many ways, were ahead of their time, dealing with similar ethical dilemmas that still plague us today. Now let's think about something else: the ink itself. While the words that scribes wrote may have been secret, the ink they used was in many ways a symbol of their power. The ink didn't just carry messages, it held the potential for immense change. Whether it was a royal decree that could reshape an empire, a religious text that could transform a spiritual tradition, or a secret letter that could alter the balance of power, the ink was the conduit for all of it. For the scribes, it wasn't just about writing down the words, it was about the weight of those words. Every line they wrote could change the course of history. Every drop of ink could create something powerful, something that would last long after they were gone. And in a society where oral tradition was still deeply valued, the act of writing something down, especially in ink, was an act of incredible responsibility. As you settle back deeper into relaxation, imagine the weight of this ink and the secrets it carried. Imagine being the one entrusted with such a responsibility. Your words could shape a kingdom, a people, and a future. Even in the quiet solitude of your scriptorium, you were part of something much bigger, something that stretched far beyond your lifetime. As you continue to drift into a state of calm, let's turn our attention to the future of West African scribes, their legacy and influence beyond their time. In many ways, the scribes' work, though deeply rooted in the context of their specific kingdoms, had far-reaching implications that stretched well beyond the borders of West Africa. And while their physical ink may have faded, the ideas, knowledge, and influence they created still reverberate today, often in surprising ways. To begin, think of the scribes as the bridge between the ancient world and the modern one. West African scribes weren't working in isolation. They were part of a larger network of scholars, traders, and intellectuals who were in contact with other parts of the world. Through trade routes, diplomacy, and religious exchanges, their knowledge found its way into the larger currents of global history. Imagine the manuscripts of Timbuktu being carried across the Sahara Desert, reaching far-off cities like Cairo or Baghdad, where scholars would study them and exchange ideas. Those scribes were part of a much larger intellectual ecosystem, one that spanned continents and connected ideas from Asia, Africa, and Europe. One of the most fascinating aspects of the scribes' legacy is how they contributed to the spread of Islamic scholarship. As Islam spread across West Africa, especially from the 11th century onward, the written word became a vital tool for maintaining religious practices and preserving sacred texts. The scribes didn't just transcribe Quranic verses. They were integral to the establishment of schools, the creation of religious texts, and the transmission of knowledge. Many of the manuscripts that survived from this period are deeply imbued with Islamic teachings, showcasing how West African scribes became critical to the development of Islamic intellectual traditions in the region. Historians still debate how much influence West African scribes had on the wider Islamic world. Some argue that while the scribes played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting Islamic knowledge in West Africa, their impact was largely regional. Others believe that the ideas and manuscripts created in places like Timbuktu became important nodes in the wider Islamic intellectual network. Either way, the scribes of West Africa were undeniably pivotal in shaping the religious and intellectual landscape of the region. But let's zoom in on something even more fascinating, the way that the scribes' legacy lives on today. In the modern world, we often think of writing and ink as something that's been completely transformed. After all, we live in an age of digital records of computers and smartphones. Handwritten manuscripts seem like something from another age, long lost to history. But when you dig a little deeper, you'll realize that the techniques of West African scribes, those early masters of ink and parchment, are still alive in subtle ways. For example, have you ever wondered about the history of calligraphy? Calligraphy, that beautiful art of writing that transcends mere words and turns writing itself into art, has deep roots in the scribal traditions of West Africa. The delicate, sweeping lines of Arabic script that became a hallmark of Islamic manuscripts are a direct descendant of the work done by scribes in places like Mali and Songhai. The way they shaped letters, carefully crafting each one with attention and precision, laid the groundwork for later calligraphic traditions. The art of beautiful handwriting didn't just emerge out of nowhere. It evolved from the scribes, who painstakingly wrote with quills and ink made from burnt bark. In fact, the calligraphic traditions in West Africa still influence the art and culture of the region today. Modern-day artists and writers often draw upon these historical techniques when creating everything from public documents to artistic works. The careful, intricate strokes of the past are still evident in the writing styles that persist today, proving that the legacy of those early scribes hasn't been lost. It's just transformed. But there's another part of the scribes' legacy that is perhaps even more important: their contributions to literacy and education. As we've seen, the scribes weren't just record keepers. They were educators, teachers, and conveyors of knowledge. The manuscripts they created were a means of transmitting information to future generations. And the schools and centers of learning they helped establish, like the famous madrasas of Timbuktu, became hubs of intellectual activity that would influence future generations of scholars and thinkers. In many ways, the scribes' role in education mirrors the role of modern educators. They helped build a system in which knowledge wasn't confined to one generation. Instead, it was passed on year after year, century after century. And while the scribes worked in a very different context, their commitment to preserving and sharing knowledge can be seen as a precursor to the modern education system. The manuscript tradition, with its emphasis on carefully written texts and formalized learning, helped lay the groundwork for later academic practices, not just in West Africa, but across the world. One of the key ways the scribes influenced education was through their role in training other scribes. To become a skilled scribe, you didn't just need to know how to write. You needed to understand the process of writing. You needed to understand how to make ink, how to prepare parchment, and how to organize a manuscript. It was an art form, and the best scribes were often those who could pass their skills down to the next generation. In many ways, the scribal tradition was a form of apprenticeship, with younger scribes learning from their elders the intricacies of the craft. Historians still argue over how formalized this system of education was. Was it a highly structured system, or was it more informal, based on familial and community ties? Some scholars believe that the system was highly organized with scribal schools and mentors. Others suggest that it was more organic, with knowledge being passed down in a more informal setting, like the home or the marketplace. Whatever the case, what is clear is that the scribes played a vital role in ensuring that knowledge was passed on and preserved. In a way, the scribes of West Africa were the original educators shaping the way knowledge would be transmitted long before the rise of modern universities. And in many ways, their legacy continues today. Whether through the preservation of ancient manuscripts, the continued use of traditional calligraphy, or the ongoing commitment to education, the scribe's influence is woven into the very fabric of society. So as you begin to feel more at ease, consider the imprint these scribes left on the world. It's not just in the ink they used, or the documents they created. It's in the very idea of preserving knowledge, of passing it on, and of ensuring that the stories of their people would survive long after they were gone. Their legacy is still alive in every teacher, every writer, and every scholar who follows in their footsteps, carrying on the tradition of writing, teaching, and learning. As the gentle rhythm of the story lulls you deeper into relaxation, let's now explore the materials behind the magic. We've already spent some time discussing the ink, the burnt bark, and the meticulous work of the scribes. But what about the surfaces they wrote on? What did they use to preserve their words for eternity? It turns out that the materials for writing in West Africa were just as remarkable and varied as the ink itself. And like the ink, these materials were often closely tied to the environment and culture of the region. Think of it like this. You've spent hours grinding your bark into the finest powder, mixing it carefully with water to form ink. Now you need something to write on. But you can't just grab any piece of paper. No. In West Africa, the scribes used what was available to them, working with materials that were both practical and deeply connected to their surroundings. The result: some of the most beautiful and unique writing surfaces you could imagine. Let's start with one of the most important and widely used materials: palm leaves. Yes, you heard that right. Palm leaves. These large, sturdy leaves were harvested from palm trees and carefully prepared to serve as a surface for writing. Palm leaves were durable and flexible, making them ideal for the tropical climate. The scribes would trim them into strips, smooth them out, and sometimes treat them with various natural solutions to make the writing surface even more receptive to ink. The result was a surface that could withstand the humidity and heat, perfect for the scribes who worked in the sweltering West African sun. But palm leaves weren't the only material that scribes relied on. Parchment made from the skins of animals like goats was another important medium. Parchment was more durable than palm leaves, and it was often used for more important documents, like royal decrees or sacred texts. To make parchment, the skin of the animal would be scraped clean, stretched out, and treated with lime to make it smooth and flexible. It was a labor-intensive process, and the resulting parchment was prized for its durability. Once it was ready, the scribes could write on it using their finely crafted ink, creating a document that could last for centuries. Historians still argue over how much parchment was used compared to palm leaves in West Africa. Some scholars suggest that palm leaves were the primary material for everyday writing, with parchment reserved for the most sacred or important texts. Others believe that parchment was more commonly used than we think, particularly among wealthier patrons who could afford the more expensive material. Regardless of the exact balance between the two, what's clear is that the materials used by West African scribes were intimately tied to the environment and the culture of the region. The palm trees, the animals, the local resources, they all played a role in shaping the written word. Now imagine being the scribe sitting in your small workshop with your palm leaves or parchment in front of you. You've carefully prepared your writing surface, your ink is ready, and you've got your quill at hand. It's quiet. Maybe only the distant sounds of the marketplace can be heard. The sun filters through the open window, casting long shadows across the room. You dip your quill into the ink, and with a steady hand, you begin to write. The words flow each letter, carefully shaped each stroke adding to the story. The material beneath your hand is not just functional. It's a part of the process, a partner in your creative act. You're not just writing on palm leaves or parchment. You're writing on the fabric of history itself. These materials were more than just practical tools. They were a reflection of the environment, a link between nature and culture. The palm leaves came from the very trees that swayed in the breeze, the parchment from the animals that roamed the earth. The act of writing itself was deeply connected to the natural world, and this connection would have been felt by the scribes every time they sat down to work. Historians still argue about the symbolism of these materials. Some suggest that palm leaves, with their connection to nature, represented the natural living world, while parchment, often associated with the animal world, was seen as more formal, a medium reserved for the most serious of texts. Others argue that these materials were simply practical, chosen for their availability and durability, with no deeper meaning attached. Whatever the case, It's clear that these materials played a crucial role in shaping the way the scribes worked and how their work was perceived. The choice of writing materials also influenced the preservation of the texts. Palm leaves, while sturdy, were more susceptible to wear and tear, especially in the humid climate of West Africa. Parchment, on the other hand, could last for centuries if properly cared for. This is why, as we look back at the surviving manuscripts from the region, we often find that the most important documents, those that were meant to last, were written on parchment rather than palm leaves. These manuscripts were the ones that were carefully stored, copied, and protected, ensuring that the knowledge they contained would survive for generations to come. But let's pause and reflect on the bigger picture. These materials weren't just about preserving knowledge, they were about making knowledge beautiful. The very act of writing on palm leaves or parchment with ink made from burnt bark was an art form. It wasn't just about transmitting facts, it was about crafting something that was worthy of preservation. Each manuscript was a work of art, a physical manifestation of the scribe's skill, patience, and dedication. It was an effort to create something that would endure, something that would be valued not just for its content, but for its form as well. This connection between the material and the message can still be felt today. Think about the books you've read or the documents you've encountered. There's something special about holding a physical book, about the feel of the paper, the weight of the pages, the smoothness of the ink. The same was true for the scribes of West Africa. The materials they used weren't just tools, they were an extension of their craft, and every manuscript they created was imbued with a sense of care and artistry. As you settle deeper into this journey, think about these materials, the palm leaves, the parchment, the ink, and how they all came together to create something timeless. The scribes weren't just writing history, they were creating objects of lasting beauty, each manuscript a bridge between the past and the present. And in a way, the materials they used are still with us, echoing through the centuries, reminding us of the artistry and dedication that went into every word, every letter, every stroke of ink. As we continue to ease deeper into the night, let's focus on one of the most intriguing aspects of West African scribal culture, the knowledge that never made it onto paper. We often talk about the ink and the materials, the art of writing. But what about the stories, the information, the wisdom that was shared verbally and never made it to the written page? In many ways, the scribes didn't work in isolation. They were part of a broader culture of oral tradition, where stories, laws, and wisdom were passed down from one generation to the next through spoken word. Think about it. The act of writing wasn't always the end of a story. In fact, it was often just the beginning. The scribes were the bearers of written history, yes, but they were also part of a much larger, more fluid tradition of oral storytelling. In many West African societies, oral traditions were as vital as written texts. These oral histories weren't just supplements to written records. They were living, breathing histories in their own right, shaping the way people understood their past, their culture, and their identity. Picture yourself as a scribe in a small West African village, the sun setting on the horizon, casting long shadows over the village square. The elders gather around the fire, recounting tales of ancient kings, of great battles fought, and of the gods who once walked among men. These stories aren't written down. They're spoken past from one storyteller to the next, in an unbroken chain, that stretches back generations. As a scribe, you know that the written word has its place, but you also know that there's a wisdom in the spoken word that is just as valuable, just as lasting. Historians still argue over the relationship between oral and written traditions in West Africa. Some believe that oral traditions were seen as an inferior form of knowledge transmission, an ancient holdover from a time before writing became widespread. Others argue that oral traditions were, in fact, the primary method of knowledge transmission, with writing serving a more secondary formalized role. The truth, as often is, the case lies somewhere in between. Writing and oral traditions weren't at odds. They were complementary. The scribes didn't see themselves as replacing the oral tradition. They saw themselves as enhancing it, preserving the most important stories in written form, while leaving the living traditions intact. The spoken word was alive in a way that the written word wasn't. Oral stories were fluid, changing over time, adding new details and interpretations with each telling. When a story was passed down orally, it was shaped by the storyteller's voice, by the audience's reactions, and by the environment in which it was told. This was something that the written word could never quite capture: the performance of the story, the way it was brought to life in the moment. In West Africa, the best storytellers were revered as much as the best scribes. They held the keys to the collective memory of the community. Now imagine you're an elder in one of these villages tasked with remembering not just the names and dates of important events, but the emotions, the feelings behind them. You're responsible for preserving the history of your people in a way that no manuscript could ever capture. The history you tell is filled with nuance, with voices and sounds, with intonations and pauses that add weight to each word. You are the living memory of your people. And as a scribe, you know that your job is not just to record facts, but to ensure that these oral traditions are passed down in written form, so they are preserved, but without losing their essence. But here's the thing. Despite the importance of oral history, some knowledge did make its way into the written world. We can't forget that scribes were the custodians of many tangible records, royal decrees, treaties, religious texts, and historical accounts of battles and conquests. However, as they transcribed, they didn't just record facts. They also captured the flavor of the spoken word. When a scribe recorded an oral tradition, they weren't just copying down a series of names or events. They were capturing the very spirit of the story. The rhythm of the words, the cadence of the voice, the way the story was woven together, all of that was embedded in the manuscript. Some scribes even went as far as adding annotations or embellishments to the written text, preserving the oral traditions in a form that would carry on for generations. This was, of course, no easy task. Oral traditions had their own unique structure, often fluid, without the rigid structure of written grammar or punctuation. The challenge for the scribe was to translate that fluidity into something fixed, something that could be shared and understood by future generations. This challenge was especially significant for scribes who worked in kingdoms where oral history was seen as the most trusted and revered form of knowledge. How could they ensure that the spoken word, with all its vibrancy and life, didn't get lost in the translation to the written page? Historians still debate how much direct influence oral traditions had on the written records produced by scribes. Some argue that much of what was written down was heavily influenced by oral storytelling traditions, with scribes serving as mediators between two worlds, the world of the spoken and the world of the written. Others suggest that the written texts were more formal and structured, distinct from the fluidity of oral traditions, and thus less connected to them. Regardless of the level of overlap, the fact remains that the scribes were responsible for preserving these oral traditions for posterity. The stories they recorded were not just written down for the sake of posterity. They were meant to be read aloud, to be passed on in turn to future generations, thus keeping the oral tradition alive in a new format. Now, as you reflect on the interplay between these two forms of storytelling, take a moment to consider how this might mirror your own life. We live in an age of digital storytelling, where videos, podcasts, and social media posts are part of our daily communication. Much like the scribes of old, we share our histories, our thoughts, and our feelings in a variety of ways, both written and spoken. And just like the scribes, we are custodians of a culture that transcends the written word, keeping oral traditions alive in our conversations and stories. In a way, the scribes and storytellers of West Africa remind us of the timeless nature of human storytelling, how it evolves, how it shifts across generations, and how it adapts to new forms while still holding on to the same deep, universal need to communicate. Their legacy doesn't just lie in the manuscripts they left behind. It lies in the stories they carried, stories that continue to echo through time. As you settle deeper into the rhythm of this journey, we come to the final stretch, a reflection on the legacy of West African scribes and how their work has shaped the world we live in today. You've traveled with me from the creation of ink, from burnt bark, through the painstaking process of transcribing history onto palm leaves and parchment. And now, at the very end of this story, it's time to step back and consider the wider implications of the scribe's efforts. Let's begin with the question that's perhaps been lingering in the back of your mind all along. Why does this matter? Why should we care about the ink stains of scribes who lived centuries ago in far-off West Africa? Well, the truth is, their legacy isn't just about ancient manuscripts or dusty scrolls locked away in libraries. It's about how those scribes thought about knowledge, about the importance of preserving it, and about the lengths they were willing to go to ensure that their stories, and the stories of their people, were passed down through the ages. In many ways, the work of these scribes speaks to a universal human impulse, the desire to remember and to preserve. The scribes of West Africa were the original archivists. Their manuscripts weren't just about transmitting knowledge, they were about curating it, organizing it, and making sure it lived on. Think of them as the first librarians of the African continent, carefully tending to their collections of written works, ensuring that each document had its place, its purpose, and its story to tell. Through their efforts, they shaped the way we think about history itself, not just as a linear sequence of events, but as something dynamic and interconnected, woven together by the scribes, who helped stitch it all into existence. They understood that knowledge is not just a static set of facts, it's a living, evolving thing, one that needs constant care and nurturing to survive. Historians still argue over the ultimate impact of West African scribes. Some claim that their contributions were overshadowed by the rise of European colonialism and the spread of Western ideas about knowledge and power. Others argue that the scribes' work was far-reaching, influencing not just the region, but also the intellectual currents of the wider world. The manuscripts of Timbuktu, for example, were seen by many scholars as a gateway to understanding the broader, intellectual traditions of Africa. and they still hold that place today, drawing researchers and historians from around the globe. And yet, for all the scholarly debate, one thing is certain: the scribes of West Africa were ahead of their time. They anticipated a world where knowledge would be not just shared, but preserved, where words would not just be spoken or written for a fleeting moment, but would remain fixed for generations to come. Their work was an act of foresight, a recognition that ideas and stories needed to be protected from the ravages of time. It was a vision that we still carry with us today. In fact, the concept of preservation, whether it's preserving knowledge, culture, or identity, continues to be a central theme in the world we live in. In today's digital age, we are surrounded by technologies that enable us to preserve everything from the latest tweets to ancient manuscripts in digital form. But just as the scribes faced challenges in their time, be it from natural elements or the political upheavals of their kingdoms, so too do we face challenges in our own age. How do we ensure that the knowledge we hold dear today will survive for future generations? How do we preserve the stories of our time the way the West African scribes preserved theirs? There's something profoundly humbling about the idea that despite all the technological advancements of our modern world, the basic need to preserve knowledge and stories remains as important as it ever was. It's a reminder that at the core of it all, we are still driven by the same desire to connect with those who came before us and to ensure that future generations can hear our voices. The scribes knew this, even in their time. They understood that every document they created was more than just ink on a page. It was a bridge across time, a link between the past, present, and future. And in that sense, they were not just writers. They were keepers of history, guardians of a cultural legacy that would extend far beyond their own lifetimes. Now, as the story winds down, consider the beauty of this process, the simple yet profound act of passing on knowledge. The scribes weren't just engaged in the mechanical task of writing. They were building something enduring. They were creating a lasting structure for the transmission of ideas, a framework that would support generations of thought and discovery. And while their specific methods may seem quaint to us today, in their time, they were as cutting-edge as any modern-day database or search engine. The scribes were the original knowledge curators, and they did so with patient skill and a deep respect for the legacy they were creating. So as you begin to drift off, take a moment to reflect on the scribes' work, not just in terms of the ink, parchment, and bark, but in the larger impact they had on the world. Their dedication to preserving and transmitting knowledge was a form of care, a form of love for their people and their stories. And that, my friend, is something that transcends time. As the darkness settles around you, let the quiet legacy of the West African scribes wash over you, those who wrote not just to record the past, but to shape the future. You see, the ink on their manuscripts might fade with time, but the stories they carried, those live on forever, etched into the very fabric of history. And now, as you rest, feel the peaceful weight of their wisdom passed down through the centuries enveloping you, in the comfort of stories well told, ink well used, and histories well preserved. Sleep, well knowing that the scribes of West Africa are still here, with you, in the quiet pages of your mind.